podcast where we capture what's top of mind for Android developers. I'm your host, Kaushik. Today, we're talking about a developer's unsung hero, logging. Logging is one of those incredibly useful tools that we often take for granted. But not today, not here on Fragmented. We're diving deep into logging, and more specifically, a library you might not have heard of yet. But first, let's take a step back and appreciate the reigning champion in Android logging, Timber. If you're an Android developer, you've likely heard of Timber. It's the gold standard of logging and is a logging library created by Jake Wharton. And it's become so popular that it's almost synonymous with logging in Android development. But why use Timber? Why not just rely on println or println in Kotlin? Oh, and there's another quick trivia. Have you ever wondered what happens when you println in your Android app? The Kotlin println internally redirects to the well-known system.out.println, which in any Java program prints to the standard output stream. But here's the interesting part. In most emulators and modern devices today, that println output stream redirects to your logcat in Android, and it typically uses the info level priority of your log. Pretty cool, huh? I mean, at least I didn't know that. Anyways, the other reason you don't want to be messing around too much with println directly in your Android app is that in order to write to your logcat file and console, you effectively are doing a bunch of I/O operations to make that happen. So just keep that in mind if you're, really using a lens and eyeing the performance of your app. Okay, let's go back to Timber. How does Timber help over println? Well, there's 3 really nice benefits that Timber brings. The first, automatic tagging. Timber automatically figures out which class you're logging from, and in the tag portion of your log, it uses that class. So if you ever log anything in your app, you'll know exactly which class that log came from. Second, it has a nice and sleek API for string substitution and avoids you having to do some crazy concatenations. We'll come back to that one in some time, but at least for the time, Timber was built with this really nice API for you to do string substitution and just have really nicely formatted logs. The third is probably the most important benefit in my opinion, and that's composite logging. You can plant trees, different trees, and send your logs to these different trees, which in turn sends it to different places depending on the context. This, if you haven't figured out, is also where the inspiration for the name Timber came from. So with this composite logging, you can have, say, a regular tree that just dumps everything locally into logcat. That could be just one tree on the side. You can have another one, a separate tree, that says any log above a certain priority, like say warning and above, send that to Crashlytics, Sentry, Instabug, or one of these other crash-based SDKs. If you have a remote logging service, many companies pay a lot of money for this service that is incredibly useful called Datadog. You could have a separate Datadog tree and have all your logs remotely sent to this Datadog service, which you can then search and filter and do a whole bunch of things. You can effortlessly redirect any of your logs and do it all with Timber. And that's where it really shines. Personally, I love Timber's flexibility. For unit tests, for example, I inject a custom logger tree that simply just uses println again. It's a clean and simple setup for, my test log. So when I run my unit tests, within the console with the results of my unit test, it also shows the output. It's kind of a nice setup. I have a screenshot of this that you can look at in the show notes. But here's where things get a little interesting. In one of my recent projects, I noticed some performance hits due to how we were logging. To be fair, this was largely our fault. We were logging massive serialized objects without, too much thought into optimization, and we were logging a lot. But it got me thinking, when was the last time someone spent time actually thinking about such a workhorse library or tool like Timber? Are there any alternatives to Timber? How does Timber do the logging internally, and has someone thought about using a different approach, for example? Turns out, sure enough, there are alternatives. There's one that I thought was particularly a fresh take on logging too, and It's called logcat. Yes, it's named after the very same logcat we all know from Android Studio. Slightly confusing, but logcat, the library, offers some really interesting improvements over Timber. Now, I could go rambling on about it, but I thought, wouldn't it be better if I just bring the maintainer of the library to talk about it on the show? And lucky for me and you, logcat was built by my good friend and past guest of the show, Piwai of Square. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Piwai to the show. Welcome to the show, Piwai.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Kaushik.
Welcome back. You've done so much for the community, like, some things like leak canary, offensive programming, which you talked about in the last episode, and now logcat, which I wanted to ask more questions. And of course, we'll point people to your resources, blog posts, and Fragments, which is arguably your most important contribution to the community, clearly.
I have to say, I want to say that sometimes I tend to, troll a little and have fun with things. Sometimes people don't realize that I'm joking. And so I'm working on making that either more obvious or sometimes being a bit more serious with things. Because,
can you give us a quick intro for those of you who at this point have been living under a rock and haven't heard you?
Nah. Thank you, though. Okay, so I'm Piwai. I've been doing Android development since 2009. And yeah, been at Square since 2013. And, I think my big claim to fame is writing Leak Canary. And I've done open source before, but this was one of the big impactful ones. And I think it all is related to just working at Square in that amazing environment where I had a lot of coworkers that were really good, but also really into open source. And that sort of so I'm thinking, Jesse Wilson, Jack Wharton, they showed me the way, and Bubbly sort of showed me the way, and I just had to emulate what they were doing, in my own small corner of the world.
And that you have. This episode, I wanted to be a lot about, logcat, the library.
Mm-hmm.
But before we even go into some of the specifics, tell us briefly about the library logcat itself. Surely you've heard of Timber.
Yeah.
So what were the motivations there? Why come up with something new?
Yeah, actually, for the longest time, I really did not want to write this library. And so, because I was like, oh, we already have Timber. We don't need another one. But what happened was, even before I joined Square, we always had log statements, and we always knew that we wanted to turn off logs in production, and we'd always have big if statements around those logs. And Timber was this amazing utility where you didn't have to do that, because you'd call it and you'd pass in a formatted string, with %s, and then a bunch of arguments, and it would actually turn into, a string.format only if you needed to. And so we had that everywhere. It was great. And then we started using Kotlin. And one of the things that started happening with Kotlin is when folks were writing these log statements, instead of writing timber.d and then the string that had this is my value %s and then comma value, they would just put the value in there, because Kotlin makes that super easy. So you'd have this is my value $value. And it's nice and it's easy, but then I guess I don't know if you want to. We can dive deeper into what happened there. But essentially, we had performance issues. I'll talk about that in a bit. And I try to ask, hey, can we get those performance issues resolved in Timber? Can we evolve Timber? And I think the stance from I can't talk for Jake, but what I gathered was his stance was Timber should be turned off in prod. You shouldn't be doing any of this in prod anyway, so there's no need to do these changes. I might be summarizing wrong, but I think the reality of what was happening is we were using Timber wrong, and so in our app. And so the question is, did we need to start using Timber right, or did we need to maybe have a thing that would tend to be used right naturally? And so that's what we went with.
By the way, I recommend anyone who comes up with an open source library to take inspiration from how you have a motivations section in your README, because that's the first question that pops up in my head when I look at a new library, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why this new library? And you've done an excellent job. So I'm going to just actually go through some of those questions. But firstly, you mentioned this thing on when Kotlin got introduced. And so one of the biggest advantages, and I'm thinking this is where that point is going, is this concept of string interpolation, right? Which is so beautiful with Kotlin. It just makes it so easy. Just slap on that dollar there, and
Yep.
you can start adding logs. What is the problem in using that? Like, why couldn't I just do that in Timber? Because Timber works in Kotlin. I could just use the same thing, and inside my message, instead of using all the arguments that Timber allows you to do the swapping with, why can't I just use string interpolation directly in that message?
That's a great question. And the thing is, actually, yeah, you can. And that's the problem. So let's talk about that. So what happens is, if you think about those logs, they go to logcat. Obviously, as a developer, when you're connected to your device, you want to see those logs. But in production, you're not connected to your customer's device, and you sort of have a couple problems. So the reason you don't want to do those logs in productions is twofold. It's number one, it's a performance issue, and I'll talk about that in a sec. And number two is you might have, I don't know, PII or data that shouldn't be printed to look at, so you don't want to run it. But the performance issue is kind of interesting. So the general performance issue with logs is simply that, when you use the dollar sign, what this actually translates into in terms of bytecode is a bunch of strings that are concatenated together, potentially with string builder. It's not necessarily the end of the world, but it might be, because first of all, if I was channeling my inner Romangui, it's like anything wasteful is wasteful no matter what, right? So like we should not be doing string concatenation at all if we don't need it. But beyond that, and especially with Kotlin, with data classes, you just put $this object in a string. Turns out it's a data class. It has a two-string implementation that will delegate two-string to all of its fields. If they themselves are data classes, all of a sudden you might be printing a giant object and turning that into a string, which will be very costly in terms of performance. So that was performance number one. The first issue we ran into, really, that I realized at some point, hold on, everywhere in the code, when we're writing Kotlin code and using Timber, we stopped using %s, we started using string interpolation. And so the thing with that, it is actually hard to evaluate the impact on performance. Like there are so many things going on at runtime and being like, maybe it's fine. It's a little bit more work, but it's so convenient. So maybe it's okay. It felt wrong, but not in a provable way yet. And then we had one more problem that sort of like really tipped the scale for me, which is, and that's entirely our fault, but I gotta mention it. So we started using, we disabled Timber in production, but then because we ship our own devices, at some point we started enabling it in some production devices, because then we could trigger an upload of logs and actually get more info about what was going on the device. So we started turning it on, fine, whatever. But then Timber has this very, very nice feature. I don't know if you've seen the debug tree. It's your option, configurable option in Timber, where you can say, oh, you know what? For the tag, you should use the class name of the class that is calling timber.d. And so that's really cool, because you don't have to put in tags anymore. You just say, hey, magically figure out the tag.
And it's so funny with Timber, right? If I think about Timber and why I would use Timber, that's the first thing that comes to me, right? Because we have other logs. You can always use it. The string interpolation makes a lot of sense. But like you said, with Kotlin, it's not that big a deal. But that automatic figure out the tag just makes it so nice, right?
It is so nice. And the problem is, and that's where, it's so cool. But I was doing performance work, and I was looking at traces, and I was seeing Timber a lot. And I'm like, why are we spending so much time in Timber? And then I realized, the magic thing that's figuring out the name of the caller, all it's actually doing is creating an exception and looking at the stack trace every time you call timber.d. And it looks at the stack trace and say, okay, what is right below under timber.d in the stack trace?
I see. So it actually fakes an exception, and then oh wow, this is something that even I didn't know. Okay,
and so it's really cool, but it's obviously very expensive to create a stack trace if you're doing that on the main thread and logging a bunch of things. And so it's the thing is the configuration that does that is called the debug tree. It's very obviously something you should not be using in production. But we had been, because it was so convenient. And when I started talking about, hey, we should turn that off, everybody got mad at me. Like, no, we need to know the class names. Like, this is so useful. And I was like, okay, but it's like slow. Like, what are we doing now? So that sort of was the nudge. They're like, okay, we have a performance problem to, string interpolation plus capturing stack traces, but that's convenient. What can we do? And then at some point we had this idea of I I don't know. I try to find where that came. I know I found a thread where I started in 2018 talking about that. Like, hey, with Scotland, could we do this? Where I realized with I think Zach Klippenstein, we talked about this. We realized, hey, we could use string interpolation. That was the first trick. The first step was like we could use a lambda, sorry, and then that and do the string interpolation in a lambda, so that if we don't want to do it, we just don't invoke the lambda. Then we realized we can use an inline function, so there's no cost to using the lambda. And then at some point, I realized, hold on, with those extension functions and those inline functions, you can actually have some information about the call site. Because you can call this when you're inside an inline lambda, and this will be the place where you're doing the call. And so I realized, hey, with that, I can actually get the class name of the thing that is calling the log. Now, it doesn't work in all of the context, but it's in many cases, it's good enough. And so that was sort of like, yeah, the impetus for doing this.
As someone who also currently now works in a company where we ship our own device, we ship our own carts, sometimes you do want to turn on the logs. And I can see maybe like Jake and Roman and all of these folks like cringing now. But there are times you want to see those logs, and it's invaluable, right, to debug some issues, especially when you work with custom hardware. And sometimes you can't just go online and see how a behavior is, because a lot of these devices are pretty customized, down to the level of AOSP, right? What is the general stance there? Is it recommended that you don't send any logs up to production? Because I can't imagine a world. Remote logging is pretty valuable, at least in the way that I work.
Yeah.
Is that how do you think about those things?
All right, so that's actually okay. So I want to talk about my ideal world, and we're not there, but I have this picture in my head that I think we'll get to. And there's a couple of things. First, logging, obviously, it has a performance impact, but it also, if you're storing on disk, there's disk, disk impact, especially if you're actually writing to disk, disk are SSDs, and you'll realize, especially if you're shipping your own device, you can basically make the SSDs age faster if you're writing a lot to disk. That's one problem. The second problem is you're uploading these logs, and now they're taking bandwidth of the customer, but also bandwidth on your end, on the receiving end, and then storage in your whatever, Snowflake or anything. And so all of that is a cost, and you're sort of like, and when you look at logs, the thing is 99% of the time you don't really need those logs, but when you need them, you need them.
Exactly. There's no other way, or it's almost really difficult to figure out an issue without having those logs in hand.
Right. So how do you do this? Well, some solutions are around sampling, and sampling can help, but it depends the type of app you have. And maybe if you have an app where you're just looking at things in aggregate, that works fine. But for us, when there's an issue, we need to look at the specific device and specific logs. Like I can't look at an average or anything like that. So the solution is, it's pretty simple, really. There's a couple of things. First, you log as you say, hey, we can log everything we want, log as much as you want, everywhere, But you do it with an approach that's similar to logcat, where it's a lambda that you're only evaluating if you want to. Now, you do a couple of things there. You don't sample. You start having server-side rules for saying what should be evaluated and what should not be evaluated. So like remote configuration based on, for example, tags or really anything you want. So now you have some devices that are evaluating the lambda, some devices that are not. Or maybe it's not just devices, but it's a specific tag you're evaluating the lambda versus not. That's step one. And then step two, what do you do with those logs? Well, you might not just upload them yet. What you might be doing is you're going to put them in a ring buffer. A ring buffer is like a list, but when you reach the max capacity, you just remove from the end and you append to the front, right? So it keeps the max size. And maybe you do that in a ring buffer that's in memory. And that gets written to disk only if the app is dying, for example. So there are ways to do that. So now that means you're barely writing to disk. And then you actually don't upload the ring buffer. But you make a ring buffer that's large enough for maybe a couple days worth of data or something like that. And then your remote, you're like, I need to investigate this device, and then you just click a button on your web or whatever, like on your desktop or anything, that goes and sends a push message to the device telling it, hey, okay, that ring buffer you have, like the couple days or so log, now it's time to upload it, send it to me. And that way you can, after the fact, you go, oh, I need this information, and you can get to look at it. But until then, the cost is zero, which I think is amazing. So that's like what I want.
I was going to follow up on what you meant specifically by evaluate the Lambda. And I think what you mean is, as you use logcat, if folks look at the API for logcat,
Yeah.
they'll realize that you put it inside a Lambda. And when you say evaluate the Lambda, you could potentially, in the way you configure your logger with logcat, you could just say, hey, no, just ignore all of it. Don't even add a logger. And in that case, all those Lambdas are. Is that a good high-level summary?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's really like several levels of, like, the first level is don't even try to figure out this, don't even create the string. So that's what I meant by evaluating the Lambda. Like, just this code becomes Noah. And then there is, okay, we're going to turn it into a log because it's important and we might want to retrieve it later, but we're actually not going to send it. And we're going to keep all of our costs small, and it's good for the customer. And then eventually we can send it, or, and there's a gradient there. You might say, oh, we're going to send 1 in 5 as sort of a sampling mechanism. Maybe you want that. But the general idea, what I really want is something that costs me nothing until I want it. And then I'm willing to pay the cost for that, like one device. So that's the solution. Now, I should mention, I'm going to do some free advertisement for a product that I don't have any involvement with, or I'm not an investor or anything like that. But there's this company, I think, let me just verify that I'm getting this right, but it's called bitdrift.io. They're doing a lot of what I described. Now, we're not using them, and so I can't tell you that it's good. I know there are some things that I maybe do differently slightly, but for the most part, they got the number of fundamentals right, like the idea of the ring buffer, and the idea of the remote configuration and all of that. And so I think we need to see more solutions that are similar to this one, either in-house or I mentioned also Bitdrift, just for context. It actually started as a inside Lyft. Essentially, it's a product that Lyft. It's an observability product that Lyft builds for itself with those constraints that I talked about. Being mobile centric, no one else is building those kind. Few companies are building those kind of tools properly, and then they forked off and became a real company. But like, I think Lyft is a small investor. Like, they didn't just leave the company; they actually forked. And so I think that tool or similar tools are really interesting. I'm not gonna talk shit about other products by name, but any big server-side observability tool that starts to add a mobile stack, you're doomed. It's very bad for performance. It's got crashes. We've tried a few. I can tell you they're bad at this. So don't go with any. I mean, that's my advice. It's personal opinion. Not Fox opinion. But that's my personal opinion. But basically, I really don't like. First of all, I don't like having a third-party library in our code base, and I pay a lot of attention to what we add. And then some of the solutions are just careless for the performance and the way they're implemented. And so I'm looking for things that are designed by core mobile engineers who understand the problem space.
Doubling down on some of the things you mentioned for logcat, what is a recommended way for me to use logcat, the library, in production?
So actually, we designed it to be dev local, or I designed it. I did not initially. I was like, not thinking about what I just described. I was just like, you know what? I just want a thing that's dev local, that doesn't send it anywhere, that completely off in production. And so that's what this is. And that's also why the name is logcat and not, observability log or whatever. To be honest, I regret that decision a little bit, because I've realized, oh yeah, actually, no, those logs can be useful if you turn them on, selectively and all that. So when I wrote this library, I was not thinking about remote observability at all. I was like, it's not happening in production unless you're able with your custom device to, upload logcat, and that's a slightly different story. I also think, I was like, let's just call it logcat, because all it is logging to logcat. And then I was like, that's actually a bad name, because people don't know what you're talking about when you talk about logcat.
It's almost too good a name where, like, it's so generic that people equate it to, capital L logging.
Yeah, I wrote this very quickly, and so over a couple of days, and I just pushed it out.
One theme, and this is mentioned again in the library, is this aspect of cognitive load. And you touched on a few advantages that you have with logcat around this theme, right? For example, you want it to be super easy. One of the challenges is when you're logging, having to think, okay, should this be in debug? Should this be in info? Should this be in verbose? Should I add a tag? What are the attributes? That cognitive load is something that you explicitly chose to avoid in the API of this library.
Yeah, I can talk about that for a bit. So the thing is, I was like, okay, if I'm going to write something that's going to solve our main problems around performance and string evaluation, I might as well try to fix the things that have been annoying me with Timber and a bunch of other libraries with logs for like a while. I realized one thing: we have a very large code base, and honestly, most of our Timber logs were using timber.d. But even when they were not, I realized that you have a large number of engineers. There's no consistency in how people are choosing priority, right? Like you talk to someone, they're like, no, obviously info means this, verbose means that, and then in this case I use this, in this case I use that. I'm like, I don't care. I'm just gonna send debug, and I can filter on the tag. And so everyone has different opinions, and this is the kind of thing that's kind of hard to um, get everybody aligned on, because you can't really write a lint for like when it's appropriate to log a thing or another thing. That's the first thing I realized is every time I would have to use Timber, I had two problems. I had which method do I need to call, because like there's a priority level, and then which arguments do I need to pass in what order again. So part of it was that it was a Java library, so you don't have the name parameters yet. But it was just like, oh well, there's a version with like an exception, there's a version without an exception. Well, and you have essentially three overloads per priority. So you ended up having with Timber 21 methods to choose from. And I was like, you know what? Most of the time, I just want to log. And so I just want to call log and pass the string and just move on. And so that was part of the design decision. There was, instead of one method per priority, the priority is going to be an argument. And then I was like, you know what? The exception is confusing because people never know if it's the first argument, if it's the second argument, how it should go. And so I said, you know what? I'll just remove the exception argument and I'll write a utility that makes it very easy to turn an exception into a string. And then when you want to log an exception, you just interpolate it as part of your error message and just put it there. And that, I don't know if it's the right call. You could definitely make a different choice, but I just simplified the API. Just a string. That's all you do. A lambda that returns a string is all you get.
I actually like that approach a lot, because we have had these discussions so many times, right? How do we bring in, because when your team becomes large enough, it's hard sometimes to control, and especially sometimes we encourage a lot of developers who don't primarily work just on Android to contribute to the code base, right? So in those circumstances, they wouldn't know these subtle nuances, right? So how do you control all of those things? Like you said, it's not easy to write a lint error for those circumstances. So I really like this approach of let's just make the API drop dead simple and almost nudge people to do the quote unquote right thing. And for everything else where you need something a little different, you have the option with tools or utilities. What prompted that?
Right. So, I mean, the first thing that prompted it was that every time I'd use a logger, I had to pause for a second and think, okay, what do I want to use again? Which method and what parameters? And so I've been trained for a couple of years now to realize, to watch myself. And whenever I have these pauses where I'm like a little confused about what to do, I switch away from, oh, I'm dumb, I don't know what to do. And I switch towards, there's something wrong here that's making it hard for me to naturally do the right thing. I started getting this mental shift, after reading this book called The Design of Everyday Things, which I highly recommend. It's not a software book at all. It's a book about design of objects in the real world. And one of the examples that most people have heard about, it's called something called Norman doors. It's this idea that you enter a shop and you have no idea whether you need to pull or push the door. And typically they'll have a sign that says push or pull. And so you have to read the sign, but you just can't get, you can't just get through the motion and go through, and your brain doesn't know what to do. You have to pause, read the sign. Sometimes the sign is wrong, or like try both ways, figure it out. Right. And that sort of like friction. And so this whole book is fascinating because it introduces you to the idea that it's not your fault. It's the designers that maybe made the wrong decision, and there are ways that you can design things that are easy to use, that are intuitive, because they're going to be based on your prior experiences, and so your brain just goes into pattern matching mode and just keeps doing, tries to do the thing that it normally would do. Um, and so I started thinking about that in the context of software. And there's a little bit of research in that domain, not too much, but I started reading some papers. And one thing that stuck with me is this idea that when you're calling an API, if you have a choice of many, many API methods, you essentially extend the time that it takes. I think it's at least linear, but you spend a lot more time trying to figure out, okay, which method do I need to call now? So an example of that kind of API, I think, is assert J, or truth, or where you assert that and like you're like, okay, which one do I want? And I don't know that I have a better solution for that, but generally speaking, if you can try to split things up so that in a given context the options are limited, that means you can go into flow and stop thinking about what you're trying to do.
Such a good lesson. And I'll make sure to add a link to that book in our show notes. It's by Don Norman, Design of Everyday Things. I can see, now I see the motivations between logcat and how you sort of chose a good default versus trying to make it super extensible from the start. A few more questions around logcats. For example, in this world now where we have compose everywhere, logcat might be a little different for people. You can't just throw a logcat, because within functions, can you actually explain that piece? And
I should explain that. So we talked about at the beginning how the debug tree in Timber is very nice because you get the tag automatically. And so one of the things that logcat does is also give you that, but without creating a stack trace. And the way that this works is that when you're inside an extension, when you're inside a function, especially when you're inside an extension function, you have access to the object you're extending, right? So logcat is actually, the signature of logcat is any.logcat, then it takes a lambda. And so any.logcat really just means when you're calling this function, you're not just calling it in, like a static method, you're actually calling it as an extension function, which means the first parameter of that function will be this, right? And so you have access to this. And what logcat does, then it does, this colon class, and then gets the class name from that and uses that as the tag. Now, that works when you're calling that function from a method that's part of an object, but that doesn't work when you're calling it from a static function, and it doesn't work when you're calling it from a compose context. So in a compose context, currently you do have to provide the tag. Now, so that's not ideal, because really it felt like a good enough hack to get started at a time where we hadn't really rolled into compose yet. And now we have a lot more compose code, and that's a little bit more annoying to use. The fix here, I think I know what the fix is. I'm just, I just haven't been maintaining that project too much lately. I just haven't had time to work on this. It's essentially, instead of a library, this needs to be a compiler plugin, a Kotlin compiler plugin that will grab, when you're calling logcat, it will just replace that with, okay, what's the file name, and and maybe even the line number. Why not? Whatever you want. Basically, you could use that as the tag and get that automatically. The downside is you then have to use this plugin in every module where you're using logcat. So there's a build time, and the real downside for me is, first, I don't know how to write a compiler plugin. I could figure that out, but then the way that these things go, you have to update the APIs all the time, and then I'm like, that's more work for me. It's not just a one-time thing.
No, and maybe that's an advertisement. So folks, this is a good opportunity. If you want feedback from, one of the best Android developers out there, here's an open request. You can help Piwai on this issue. I'll link to the issue because I also did see it in the GitHub issue.
I think it's also, I'm always for I don't think we need to have one library for everything. I think it's okay. Like if someone wants to make their own thing, it's like we have Kotlin inject and we have Dagger and we have Coin, and I'm not going to start the debate, but I think it's good that we have several things to look at, right? And so I absolutely would not be. Actually, I mean, I really think just Google should build their own thing there, but they won't. So if someone wants to build a better one, that's okay. You can also contribute that.
It's a very generous outlook, and I appreciate that. I think, more of us need to adopt that approach. Typically, when I use Timber in some of my production apps, I have multiple loggers and I send them separately to these remote logging services depending on the context, right? So I'm, in one of my tools, if I'm taking a screenshot and I have to report an issue, I am definitely sending some logs with that so that, I have everything in the same context. With logcat, if you look at the library, it doesn't look like it supports that, just like Timber does, because it's so explicit in Timber with the multiple trees concept. But it is possible in logcat.
Yeah. So the big thing was, I was like, so essentially, when you're looking for multiple trees, what you're trying to do is you're going to say, well, okay, I want to have different logger implementations. One's going to log to logcat, another one to a remote. And my initial thought was, well, if you start having this, then you need to think about how your loggers are going to be called from different threads, and how you need to have a list that is the list of loggers need to be accessed concurrently. You might be removing a logger from one thread while you're trying to log to all the loggers from another thread. And it's all, you can work around that, but it felt like, okay, I don't know exactly what the best, like there's going to be a cost to supporting this, and I'm not sure that I can figure out the best thing right now. And then I realized, hey, if you just can set one logger, that's the API right now. Yeah, there's one listener essentially that listens to all logs. Then nothing prevents you from having an implementation that has the support for adding several loggers, several listeners, do whatever you want in terms of threading and all that. And so I was like, hey, you don't need a list, you just need the one. Now, the part that I somewhat regret is that it makes it hard for open source libraries to automatically start listening to this, because there can only be one. So you can't just go and say, hey, Timber, add the logger here. But anyway, so I think that's something that I would likely revisit at some point. But for now, all you have to do is create your multi-listener implementation of this single listener, and then go from there.
Makes sense. PY, this is great. I love all the information that you've given us so far. What are some things that you think people should think about in general? Give us some general tips around logging and observability. Clearly, you've worked on an app where you've had to look at this, the performance implications on this. What are some parting tips that you leave us with?
I think as soon as you reach enough complexity, you can't figure out what's going on locally by trying to reproduce. It's very quickly, when an app grows, very quickly the experience you're having as a developer has nothing to do with the experience your customers are having. And you sort of like end up, it's like, I don't know, throwing darts in the dark kind of thing. You have no idea what you're doing. And so that's where observability, the ability to see what's going on a device after the fact, is crucial, very important. So I think my advice is twofold. It's like, add more data, but also don't do it because it's bad for performance. And so basically, it's a bit of, it depends. And that sort of ties back into my answer earlier around how you need to build systems that let you get the data you need when you need it, but otherwise make sure that you don't pay the price.
Piwai, thank you so much for joining us. What's the best place for us to follow the great stuff that you've been doing? You've been experimenting with different platforms and you have multiple outlets. So give us all of it. I want to make sure that I don't miss a single thing that comes out.
Okay, so my website is p-y.wtf.
This goes back to the whole trolling thing. You're pretty good at some of this stuff. Yeah.
No, it stands for Who's That Frenchie?
I see. Of course.
And so,
that's definitely what it stands for. Yeah.
And then I'm mostly these days, I'm a lot more active on Blue Sky. So it's going to be at p-y.wtf on Blue Sky. You can find my Mastodon on my website, but I'm currently very active on Blue Sky, and that's the only place really.
Piwai, thank you so much for giving us your time. and I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate. I love the Android community. I think I will be doing Android until I die, or maybe I won't die. I don't know, but really love meeting everybody, and thank you for having me. This is cool.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you found this episode interesting. Hopefully, after listening to this episode, you're just a little more curious about your everyday workhorse tools and libraries. I'll catch you all in 2 weeks in the next episode.